Well, welcome everyone. Today we're going to just take a few minutes to do a quick update on phosphorus here as we're heading into springtime, and maybe what I have to say will tweak a few ideas. It's going to be fairly short because guys are running out of time at this time of the year, being spring. I'm going to try and cover these in very short order. The role of P in plants, how the plant actually behaves to get a hold of P out of the soil, reaction in the soil, factors influencing P uptake, and what you can do about dealing with your phosphorus. And I'm going to try and stay on track because sometimes I can get a little ahead of myself. The first part, the role of P. Phosphorus is key to life. I mean, it's used for energy here in ATP production. It's used in terms of building the DNA. You can see that the DNA contains a lot of phosphorus and sugars and nitrogen, and it covers every plasma membrane in the plant. These little blue dots are phosphorus. So really it is key to life on Earth in all organisms. And that's why all organisms are after it. Now here are some of the issues relative to dealing with phosphorus that have bugged me over the years. And one is the mobility of the product of the actual element. So I'll talk about that in a sec, but here's something that's important. We're losing phosphorus every time we pull a crop. You can see that here's a shot of wheat, and the phosphorus here in the grain is about 80% of the total uptake of phosphorus leaves the field with the grain. And if we look at other crops, the same thing holds true. For example, peas, this is uptake, the top number, and then this is removal with the seed. So we're losing about 3/4 pounds with every bushel of peas, 8/10 of a pound with soybeans, and about a pound with canola, and about 7/10 of a pound with wheat. So every crop we harvest off the prairies leaves Western Canada, goes to some city or goes to some foreign market, and we're forced to put it back. And I use canola as my model usually because a pound of a bushel is kind of easy to work with. So if you're growing a crop of 50 bushels or 60 bushels of canola, that means you're removing somewhere around 50 to 60 pounds of phosphorus per year, as long as you're growing canola, and a little less with the other crops. So if you don't replace that over time, you wear it down. You just keep taking it and taking it and taking it, and that's one of the issues. And the other issue with phosphorus, it's not readily available to the plants. And we need to have phosphorus all year long. This just shows 3 of the major crops we grow here in Western Canada, and you can see all of them take phosphorus up as phosphate, throughout the whole year, right up until the minute before death of the plant, because the plant is using it to finish off the seed. It uses throughout its growing life cycle for production of those cells for the ATP and all of those key nutrients or purposes that the plant has for phosphorus in its growth cycle. And throughout its actual in-year cycle, that amount required varies. For example, this is canola, and this comes out of Saskatchewan. But early on, when most of the documents should read say that the plants need phosphorus early, and that is true because in that early growth stage, they're growing a lot of cells, they're using a lot of ATP, and the demand is high. Fortunately, in the prairies where we have minimum tillage largely, there is a lot of phosphorus in the upper zones, the top 2, 3, 4 inches of the soil. So there's quite a bit there. But we still need a popper from time to time, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But throughout the growing cycle of the plant, you can see here at first flower to 50% flower, when the plant is really building cells, it uses a lot of phosphorus. A little bit less later on, and then when we're pod filling to 50% pod, we use a lot. So we need that phosphorus throughout the life cycle. It varies depending on time, just like it does with potassium and sulfur and nitrogen. But we need it there all the time, and that's why things like Crystal Green and MAP actually have different sort of release curves. But all of those phosphorus products are put in the ground to support that growth throughout the entire year. So that's basically, sort of the initial part of phosphorus. It's needed by plants and all organisms and microbes in the soil. So what does the plant do? How can the plant deal with homeostasis, the actual balance? So the plant has sensors everywhere in its root system and in its shoot, and it's measuring phosphorus levels. So when it's short, it can do certain things. It can change its root structure. It can grow more advantageous roots. It can grow longer lateral roots and longer root hairs. It can secrete more organic acids and phosphatases to try and extract that phosphorus from the soil and the organic matter. And it can form relationships with arbuscular mycorrhizae to help it secure phosphorus and zinc and other hard to get minerals from further out than the rhizosphere and the lateral roots. They can go out and bring those nutrients back, and the plant will give it sugar for carbon. So everybody's happy. When the plant is doing that, in early spring, you're either side banding or you're putting some in furrow, the plant is taking that up, and we'll just use this left part of this diagram where the plant only uses phosphorus in the inorganic stage as for making up molecules. So when it's getting that early boost because of your fertility program, of which the plants get maybe 20 to 30% of the phosphorus applied in that years, it's getting too much. So it takes it and stores it in the vacuole, like it does with potassium and it does with everything else. And then it uses the vacuole to cushion the demand and the supply. And as it shows here, and we talked about, it then uses that phosphorus to make all of these kinds of products in the plant. And how does it do that? Well, to add to that, here's a shot showing the exudates at the root tip. And those exudates for phosphorus are usually citrate, malate, and oxalic acids and ions that can be used to absorb phosphorus from the organic matter and the mineral content of the soil. And we'll talk about a little bit more of this in a second when we talk about pH in terms of calcium and so on. But, there's always a question, is it better to put orthophosphorus phosphate into the soil or polyphosphate into the soil? And in the end, it would appear it doesn't matter. The plant only takes up as orthophosphate, and whichever form that is in the soil, eventually it is all converted to ortho in the plant. So it really doesn't matter. The polyphosphates are transformed to to orthophosphates within a week to 10 days to maybe 2 weeks at the most, depending on the soil conditions and the environmental conditions. So the plant can do those kinds of things. It's like a digestive system in the stomach. It extracts the nutrients from the food you eat, and the plant extracts those nutrients from the soil in which it lives. And in fact, the plant can control where it puts out these lateral roots. And I'll tell you something interesting about canola. These are canola roots, and you can see it, and it's a seedling. You can see that the plant puts out these lateral roots at various locations, and it's got a lot of root hairs and a lot of root hairs on the lateral roots. And canola is really good at extracting phosphorus from the soil because it puts its lateral roots out laterally. It doesn't bend down much, right in the top soil profile where most of the phosphorus is, because in a minimum till situation, we're putting the phosphorus down and it doesn't move far. The other thing that's unique about canola is it has much stronger acids and capabilities to extract nutrients, and it has longer root hairs. So the longer the root hair, the more distance it can move into the soil, and it can extract the phosphorus. And phosphorus doesn't move much except by diffusion, and we'll get to that in a sec. And I just wanted to show you, here's a shot showing that the plant, depending on what it's after in the soil, the nutrients it's short of, can place the lateral roots at various locations. And you can see here, this is in a faba bean, that the plant, even before you even see the lateral roots coming out, it already is forming lateral roots at various locations along the taproot and the lateral roots. So the plant can manage and change all these things genetically in response to the shortage or the oversupply of phosphorus. One thing you should know is that phosphorus itself, phosphate, when I use the two sort of interchangeably, but it's all about phosphate is what the plant is basically picking up phosphorus as itself does not exist really alone in the soil environment or almost anywhere else. It's always tied up with something. But these lateral roots are really placed in position depending on what the plant needs to get. And here you can see, this shot showing lateral roots moving into crystal green and dissolving it by putting out those exudates. And when it does that, it then explodes those lateral roots to take advantage of it. So if you've got a sideband, for example, or you've got a deep band, when the lateral roots find it, it will extract that phosphorus. Now, phosphorus itself isn't really going to cause toxicity to the plant in terms of overdosing close to the seed or seedling. It's the salt index that is a problem. And if it's in a mid-row band further away or a side band, it would be the ammonium that will be toxic. The plant can control phosphorus or phosphate uptake by shutting down its transporters, but it can't really deal with the pH changes as effectively. So that's what the plant can do. It can do whatever it needs to deal with that homeostasis. Now, what are the reactions in the soil? Because that has always been the baffling part about phosphorus. As most of you know, I'm more of a plant physiologist, having been an entomologist and still am. And the soil component has always been a mystery to me, so I've had to learn this as I go. But the soil contains phosphorus in either mineral content or in organic matter. In organic matter is all of the old plant material that died and all the organisms that have used phosphorus that died. So all that phosphorus tied up in the cells is sitting there, but the plant can't get it without breaking it out. So how it does that, I talked about with the phosphatases and all those acids. Now, in organic soil, we have about 200 pounds of phosphorus per 1% organic matter. So at 2-3% organic matter, we'll have a lot of phosphorus in the organic matter, which is tough for the plant to get. And then it's got the mineral phosphorus. But the real trick about phosphorus is, even though it's an anion, negatively charged, and in principle, it should move readily in the soil because soil is negatively charged and it shouldn't attach to the colloids very tightly. The trouble is that phosphorus is very insoluble and it reacts very quickly. So what we have going on in the soil, we have a continuous change. We have absorption of phosphorus onto particles, and then we have desorption or release. We have immobilization, which is moving phosphorus into organic matter, and then we have breakdown of the organic matter or mineralization to release the phosphorus, and that goes into solution, and then it's picked up by the plant. But then we have this precipitation. In other words, it can form reactions with things like calcium, iron, and aluminum, and it precipitates out, so it's unavailable. And then some of that is then released and made available again. And all of these processes are going on, and these are the molecules that are picked up by the plant because they're small enough to be taken up through the root transporters. And that's the soil solution. That's the only amount that's available. And I've got 3 slides on this because this is really the key to understanding phosphorus. So we have inorganic and organic phosphorus that's kind of tied up here. We have microbes working on that all the time to solubilize, and it's immobilizing and mineralizing. And then we have phosphorus in solution or dissolved P, and that's what the plant can take up. And the microbes are key to releasing that. So when we have microbial activity, we need moisture, we need heat, and we need that organic matter and carbon for them to actually work. So here's the last slide. So here's what happens. We have this large fixed pool of phosphorus that's tied up called non-labial. The phosphorus is released slowly into the active pool, and then some of it is tied up. And then as the plant picks up this phosphorus from the soil solution, the active pool releases some, and some of this gets tied up. So this whole process is going on all the time, from the fixed to the solution with an intermediate. And that activity varies depending on the soil, the temperature, the microbial activity, and to some degree the plant. So that's why there's hardly any soluble phosphorus available, maybe a pound per acre at any given time. So it's always slowly moving from one state to the other. When we fertilize, we can't get it to move very far because you can see phosphorus doesn't move. It gets tied up very, very quickly. And that's why we only get about 20% to 30% uptake of phosphorus from what you apply. But if you go back to that big permanent pool there, man, there's a lot of phosphorus in the ground. And over time, we know that we can get almost all of that phosphorus. It may take years, but we basically get it back. It's a matter of how much is released every year, how much we're taking away, and how much we're putting back in that balance. So here are the factors that really influence that uptake. Soil pH. We'll talk more about that because that's really key. The organic matter, how much is there and how much is in the organic matter. The clay content. The higher the clay content, the more surface area, the more it's tied up. So if you got a cation exchange of 30-35, man, you need a lot of phosphorus there because it's tied up. Whereas at sandier soils, you don't have as much, but not nearly as tied up. Mineralogy, how much of the actual mineral have you got left that hasn't been broken down? Where did you place that phosphorus? Did you put it in the seed row? Did you sideband it? Did you broadcast it? All of that will influence the availability. Compaction. One of the serious issues I see across the prairies, if you have severe compaction, roots can't go down and get past that compaction zone very easily without spending a lot of energy. Water can't go down, and you can't move nutrients down into those lower zones. So compaction reduces oxygen supply as well, and that is really affecting that balance between the permanent phosphorus and that available soluble phosphorus. Other nutrients, if you got deficiencies, especially nitrogen, for example, you're not going to be able to get use of the phosphorus in the way that the plant wants to. Nitrogen is key. As I said right in the beginning, nitrogen and phosphorus are really essential to get those plants going. So generally, you get a response with phosphorus when you have adequate nitrogen in there. And of course, I'm a believer that if you don't deal with all the three big ones or four big nutrients, NP, K, and S, you're not going to solve anything with micros. And then the relationship with our vascular mycorrhizal fungi. That really helps provide phosphorus in there. And if you are growing canola after canola, you really reduce those mycorrhizal fungi. And we have products that you can use to supplement your soil and re-inoculate your soil after canola and other crops that don't support mycorrhizal fungi. And as I again mentioned briefly, temperature, moisture, aeration, effect of mineralization on organic matter all influence the availability of phosphorus. And this is one of the key ones. As you can see, here's the pH range in the bottom, and these are what happens when the pH changes. You can see that between about 6 and 7.2, it's the ideal location for uptake of phosphorus. As the pH drops and you get aluminum levels below or above, say, 400 parts per million, phosphorus can be tied up with aluminum and become insoluble. As you get even to lower pHs, not so much here in the prairies, it ties up with iron and can precipitate out, making it very difficult for a plant to get any of that. As you move higher and you get up about above about 7.5, you get free carbonates, and it'll tie up that phosphorus. Now you can see also that the tie-up or fixation, as it's typically called, is not as bad with calcium, because plants can, through the acids they're excreting in the rooting zone, drop that pH, which then releases that phosphorus more readily there at the high pHs than you get when you have low pHs, where the plant can't really basify that soil and extract that phosphorus. So phosphorus, if you're in that perfect zone, you've got a maid in the shade in terms of managing your phosphorus largely. Now, what can you do? Here's the simple answer. And this even applies if you don't have soil tests, but man, I would sure recommend that. If your soil test shows very low to low, you're going to apply more than you took out in the last crop, and you're going to build. You're going to put, say, let's say you grew, we'll do an easy one. Let's say you grew 50 bushels of canola. Well, for the next crop, you're going to have to put 50 bushels in there and then build some if you're low, if your soil test shows you're low. If you're in the medium to high range, you can balance the input and removal. So all you do there is put in your removal. You don't have to add anything else to build. You just maintain it at your medium to high level. And you would put up a pop-up, put in a pop-up. If you have excess amounts, say you're 30, 35 parts per million, all you might need there is a starter fertilizer, a starter P. So it depends on the level you're at. And the lower the level that you have to start, the better your response is to the phosphorus. So as a result, as you have more and more, you put less and less phosphorus in because you're not going to get as great a response. Now, for some of you guys that have really good phosphorus levels, and with the high price of phosphorus this year, you might be able to get away with just putting a pop-up in, maybe even here, depending on how close you are to the high end of the range. Now, here's the trick. The first 15 to 20 pound increment gives you about 75% of your year's yield increase. The second 15 to 20 is only going to give you that extra 20 to 25%. So if you add your removal and say it's 50 pounds and you add another 15 or 20 pounds, you're probably in good shape. And you're going to build some and provide enough there for the season. That's the economics. I got this from Elson Solberg. So here just shows some stuff out of Manitoba that shows that the lower your level is, the better your chance of response, which is nothing surprising, and that's how that little graph that I showed really developed. The one key thing is soil temperature. We know that soil temperature really inhibits the uptake of phosphorus. It's not that it's not there. It's just that because it's immobile and the colder it is, the less mobile it is in diffusion, the slower roots are growing, and therefore the plant is struggling to get that. As it warms up, the roots grow faster. The roots can go through the soil, and once you get up into that 20 range, the plants can really scavenge the soil, extract the phosphorus from the organic matter and the mineral matter at the same time. So temperature really influences things, and that's why we put the phosphorus down early. We do it with something like Active Prime. We then put in Crystal Green, or we put in MAP or something like that to feed those plants early and hopefully throughout the growing season. And worst case scenario, after the plants are up, you can do a tissue test, or you can apply a foliar phosphorus in something like a build, which has a high level of phosphorus, and supplement that should you not have enough there, or you get a better than expected crop going. I throw this in here just to show you that you want to be careful on how much you put in the seed row because of salt indexes. One of the advantages we have with Crystal Green is the salt index is low, so we get very little any impact on any kind of seed mortality or salt index problems with pulling water out of the seed and any toxic effects that you might get from a fast release of say ammonia from any one of these products. The things that restrict you to some degree, and this is common from most of the publications on phosphorus in the prairies, you're limited in terms of how much P you can put in row if you're limited to simply putting an in row phosphorus product, say with a 1-inch opener in this particular case. And you can see that cereals are much more tolerant to the application of phosphate compared to a canola. The smaller the seed, usually the bigger the problem in terms of salt index and toxicity to the seed goes. One last thing here that we can talk about is that when you put a sideband in and you use a lot of urea and you're putting your phosphorus in with that urea band, you can have a delay in uptake because the plant roots were not going to want to penetrate that high ammonium band, which might be okay. In a mid-row band, you haven't got that much of a problem because by the time the roots get there, the ammonium has been modified to nitrate and it's dispersed into the soil zone, so you haven't got that toxicity. But if you've got a sideband in there, you might have a short delay in terms of accessing the phosphorus in that sideband. So in summary, why is it so hard for plants to get P? Well, it's tied up easily. Not much is ever in solution. It doesn't move. Weather affects it and is unpredictable what the weather's going to be. Lots leaves the field. We got to put lots back usually. It's not easy to replace that uptake. You got limitations on how much you can put in furrow or even in the sideband if you really deplete your phosphorus levels. Compaction interferes, which is growing. It's now pretty costly. And species and cultivars respond differently. I talked about, canola, it's got a big root. Wheat has a big root. Peas and lentils have small roots. They all vary in terms of their ability to respond to the application. And the response to application is variable, just like the field. So there are a lot of difficulties with it. So to leave you with this, think about pH, far from 6 to 7.2. If you're either direction from that, you've got some things that are going to be affecting your efficiency. Cold soils, low P soil tests are going to inhibit the access of phosphorus to your plants. A previous crop of non-arbuscular mycorrhizal organisms like canola, buckwheat, and beets will reduce the availability of P. We have minimal placement options, so be aware of what those placement options are and the amount you can put in there and which products you're going to put in there, because it makes a difference. We have crop sensitivity relative to that placement. And do you know your nutrient levels? If you don't have a soil test or you don't know what your nutrient levels, and you run into deficiency of both macro and micronutrients, all your efforts in just looking at phosphorus are going to be somewhat limited because it takes all of those nutrients to build that crop. That's my short summary. It's kind of springtime here in the prairies. I thought I'd try and give you something to think about to keep you going, and maybe to listen while you're driving the truck or you're having coffee, and maybe it'll give you a few ideas on how to move forward with your phosphorus management this year. Thanks a lot.